The 8,137th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. I now give floor to the representative of China.
主席先生，
Mr. President, China would like to thank Secretary General Guterres for his briefing. China firmly opposes the development by the DPRK of its nuclear and missile programs in violation of the Security Council resolutions and urges the DPRK to abide by the relevant resolutions of the Security Council. Since the beginning of this year, the situation on the Korean Peninsula has been one of constant tension, while the DPRK continued to conduct nuclear tests and missile launching in defiance of the universal opposition by the international community. The parties concerned kept expanding military exercises and scaling up show of force. Escalation of tension on the Korean Peninsula to the point of risking spiraling out of control is not in any party's interest. Mr. President, the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula has lasted for over 2 decades with deep historical causes and grave and complex current context. Reviewing the evolution of the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula, we can see that when the parties concerned moved towards each other and respected each other's concerns, it was possible to achieve results, whereas when the parties took tough stances and disregarded the security of the other side, it would lead to the deterioration of the situation. The current situation on the Korean Peninsula is mired in a vicious circle of tough posturing and confrontation, which hardly makes one optimistic about its future. However, the hope for peace is not totally obliterated. There is still a possibility for negotiation, and the option of use of force is unacceptable. China believes that all parties concerned should keep in mind the big picture of maintaining peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, judge the situation calmly, make wise choices, and take practical actions. First, it is necessary to put an immediate end to rhetoric and actions that are unfavorable to denuclearization as well as peace and security of the Korean Peninsula and ease the situation as soon as possible. The tough positions taken by the parties concerned can only escalate tension, deepen division, and increase mutual trust, and therefore are not helpful to the security of all parties. The parties concerned should keep calm and exercise restraint to prevent the situation on the Korean Peninsula from worsening and getting out of control, and create necessary conditions for turning the situation around. Secondly, it is necessary to act in accordance with the provisions and spirit of the Security Council resolutions on the DPRK and push for an appropriate settlement of the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula. Since last year, the Council has adopted unanimously a series of resolutions on the DPRK. These resolutions represent the common will of the international community and constitute international obligations that must be observed by all parties. All parties must implement the Council resolutions on the DPRK comprehensively and in their entirety, strengthen non-proliferation measures to curb the DPRK's nuclear and missile programs, and also actively push for a peaceful settlement through diplomatic and political means. At the same time, there is a need to avoid negative impact on the livelihood of the people of the DPRK and the humanitarian assistance activities in the country. Unilateral sanction measures without the authorization of the Security Council undermine the unity of the Council and hurt the legitimate rights and interests of other countries and should therefore be abandoned. Thirdly, it is necessary for all sides to shoulder their due responsibilities and fulfill their own obligations in earnest. The current situation on the peninsula is not caused by any one party alone, and it is not helpful to impose on any one party the responsibility of resolving the problem. The parties concerned should move towards each other instead of engaging in mutual blaming. Still less should they try to shift their responsibilities to others. The U.S. has committed to not seeking regime change, not pursuing the overthrow of the DPRK's government, not accelerating the reunification of the Korean Peninsula, and not moving its troops beyond the 38th parallel. We hope that the U.S. will turn these 4 commitments into concrete actions. Fourthly, it is necessary to remain committed to peaceful settlement and resume dialogue and negotiations as soon as possible. The core of the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula is security, so the fundamental solution lies in addressing in a balanced way the security concerns of all parties, including the DPRK. There is no military option when it comes to the settlement of the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula, and resort to force can only bring disastrous consequences to the peninsula. Sanctions are a means, not the end. History shows that dialogue and negotiations are the fundamental way to ease tension and advance denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. The parties concerned should endeavor to turn the pressure of sanctions into the driving force for the resumption of dialogue and negotiations, and pull the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula back to the right track of peaceful settlement through dialogue and negotiations at an early date. Mr. President, as a close neighbor of the Korean Peninsula, China has persisted in promoting denuclearization of the peninsula, maintaining peace and stability on the peninsula, and seeking a settlement through dialogue and negotiations. China is opposed to conflicts and chaos on the Korean Peninsula. China has always supported and implemented comprehensively and strictly the Security Council resolutions on the DPRK. In so doing, China has made greater efforts and paid a higher price than anyone else. It is irresponsible to doubt or challenge what China has done. In view of the current situation on the peninsula, China has put forward the suspension for suspension proposal, namely suspension by the DPRK of nuclear and missile activities and suspension by the U.S. and the ROK of large-scale military exercises. We have proposed the dual-track approach of promoting parallel progress in denuclearization and the establishment of a peace mechanism on the peninsula. The Russian Federation has also put forward the idea of a phased approach to the settlement of the issues of the Korean Peninsula. On the basis of the above proposals, China and the Russian Federation issued a joint statement on July 4th this year, proposing a roadmap for the settlement of the Korean Peninsula's problems. The joint proposals of China and Russia are practical and feasible and are aimed at promoting the peaceful settlement of the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula and maintaining the peace and stability on the peninsula. As such, we hope they will elicit response and support from the parties concerned. Mr. President, due to historical reasons, the Korean Peninsula is still in the shadow of the Cold War. This is the root cause for the protraction and lack of settlement of the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula. The parties concerned need to reject Cold War thinking in all its forms, establish a concept of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, and seek a peaceful settlement of the Korean nuclear issue through political and diplomatic means, so as to realize at an early date denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and long-term security and tranquility of the Northeast Asia for the benefit of the people of the countries in the region. China stands ready to work together with the parties concerned and the international community to continue to play a positive and constructive role for the realization of this goal. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I now give floor to representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, ministers. I would like to thank the Japanese presidency for having convened this important meeting. And I would also like to thank the Secretary General for his very elucidating briefing. Mr. President, France is deeply concerned at the worsening situation on the Korean Peninsula and by the significant risks that arise for our collective security. This year, the North Korean regime fired 20 ballistic missiles, 3 of them intercontinental, and carried out a nuclear test on an unprecedented scale. And we have met 17 times, 12 of those times on an emergency basis. North Korea today is an existential threat for our partners in the region, and I would like to assure them of our complete, total solidarity in the face of this unacceptable situation. This unprecedented accumulation of illicit action, which is increasingly destabilizing, has all the hallmarks of a dangerous escalation. The risk is real and proven, and has already reached an elevated and increasing level. This is why inaction and weakness are not options. So, for France, our action should be guided by three priorities. The first of these priorities is to show ourselves clear-sighted in the face of the extreme seriousness of the situation. The multifaceted progress of North Korea in the nuclear area, including its ballistic capacity, and probably in the chemical area as well, really does change the situation. The regional threat has now become a global threat, an immediate threat. Let's not be under any illusions. This threat is unprecedented and has no equivalent. The North Korean regime, however, has up to date shown no intention to reverse course. By marching ahead with its nuclear and ballistic illicit programs, it continues to flout its international obligations and to defy this council, and that to the detriment of its own population. I would stress here that the dramatic situation for human rights in North Korea is getting worse, and we heard about this at the beginning of this week with regard to the humanitarian situation. It is the North Korean regime which is primarily responsible for this. Mr. President, in the light of this very dangerous and volatile situation, and this is my second point, our central line of action must be to stand firm. First of all, because the dangerous downward spiral that North Korea has engaged upon threatens the very foundations of our collective security system, and together we have the responsibility to preserve that. It is essential that we react to this testing of the non-proliferation regime and avoid any impunity which would necessarily lead others to call this into question. What is at stake here is our ability to ensure our own security, but also to stop the overturning of the strategic balance in Asia, and beyond that, the strategic stability which is the foundation for peace and security. As part of this, our action should contain two areas. It is indispensable, first of all, to implement existing sanctions strictly and comprehensively in the face of the formidable inventiveness of the North Korean networks to circumnavigate and escape the effects of these decisions. Everyone knows the uneven implementation of sanctions seriously affects the effectiveness of our collective action. Their correct implementation is the responsibility of all member states, beginning with these seated on this council. We must also react methodically and with determination to all North Korean provocations in order to prevent further escalation and to preserve the non-proliferation regime. If North Korea continues to ignore our injunctions to defy them and not to show reason, North Korea will leave us with no other choice than to stand firm and to strengthen sanctions. And let's understand that sanctions are not a goal in themselves. They target the regime for what it does and not for what it is. Mr. President, the third and final priority must be the potential for diplomacy to find a political solution. We do not and have never closed the door to dialogue. All of our efforts, on the contrary, are aimed at convincing Pyongyang to come back to the table of negotiations and to accept negotiations on its nuclear and ballistic program. But we are forced to state that given the stubbornness of North Korea, only maximum pressure today can enable us to come back to the path of negotiation. Mr. President, France, of course, is in favor of a resumption of talks, but it is up to the North Korean regime to give us clear indications that it is prepared to open discussions, and the sooner the better. Mr. President, France's belief is that maximum pressure on the North Korean regime is our best lever to enable dialogue, which itself is the condition for a political solution. Otherwise, everything will be seen as a sign of weakness by North Korea, expressions of division between us. They will be encouraged to continue their provocations. And objectively, that will run the risk of things getting even worse and more extreme. So, quite simply, France would call on this Council to show firmness. That is our best antidote in the light of the risk of war, and it's our best chance to open up the path to dialogue and therefore to a political solution that we all seek. I thank you.